Okay, folks, if you give me your attention, we'll get started. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the First Division Museum at Cantigny. Delighted to have you here. Welcome to Cantigny. If you have not been here before, spare me just a few minutes. Cantigny is the historic estate of the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, longtime owner and publisher of the Chicago Tribune, who left this historic estate as a park for the people of Illinois. And second only to the Tribune in the Colonel's heart was the 1st Division of the United States Army, in which he served as a citizen soldier in World War I, and specifically at a little village in France named Cantigny, which was America's first battle of World War I and first battle for the freedom of Europe. He named this estate in honor of that battle and in honor of his comrades in the 1st Division, and was devoted to those comrades and to the legacy of the 1st Division in the Army and to veterans for the rest of his life. And so that's why there's a 1st Division Museum on Cantigny Park. We see our mission here broadly. It is, first of all, to present the history of the 1st Division, because that's what the Colonel wanted done. And it's a 100-year-old division that has several thousand soldiers in Afghanistan today. It has not been off of active duty for a single day since June of 1917, when it was organized on the docks of Hoboken, New Jersey, to go to France in the Great War. And so millions of Americans have served us wearing the shoulder insignia of the 1st Division. But we present that history more broadly because we are a democracy. And our Constitution says that our form of government and our laws are established by we the people, or by us the people, I guess, in part for the common defense. And so what that means is that our soldiers, our divisions, our Army, Air Force, Marine Corps, Navy, belongs to us. Those are our brothers and sisters, our sons and daughters. It is our future for which we may or may not choose to fight. We have an investment in our common defense. And as citizens in a democracy, we are ultimately responsible and accountable. Those things do not belong to the brass. They do not belong to the Pentagon. They do not belong to the president, although for his tenure he is the commander-in-chief. They belong to us. And that gives us a certain amount of responsibility. So we think we make that heritage accessible to you, the American public, by the work that we do. And then the other thing we want people to do is think not only about the compelling history of the 1st Infantry Division and all of our armed services and honor the service of all of our veterans, but we want us to think about contemporary military issues that are very much on the minds of decision makers in Washington, and therefore ought to be on our minds to a certain degree. And that's why we're absolutely delighted to have Dr. Rebecca Seatman here and the Wheaton College debate team. I will let her introduce her team and describe the parliamentary procedures that we'll observe tonight, but I'm absolutely delighted to have this turnout to listen to what I'm sure is going to be a tremendous debate. I'll set the stage very briefly. The Pentagon, the Department of Defense, has adopted a concept known as air-sea battle. The students will explain what it is, but essentially it is designed to integrate all of the armed services to counter what they perceive as an anti-access strategy by potential enemies of the United States sometime in the future. That is, strategies to deny us access to places that we want to go. And it is very, very controversial within the Department of Defense, and very, very controversial within the broader defense and diplomatic communities for reasons that you will see as the debate unfolds. What we're going to do is we're going to let Dr. Seatman and her debate team conduct their debate, and then y'all are going to vote. Now, here's how we're going to do that. At whatever point that she tells me that the formal debate is over, we're going to have a brief period for questions and answers from the audience and comments. So if you've got questions of any of the participants, you can ask them. If you've got comments on either how well they presented their case or on the merits and demerits of the concept of air-sea battle, you can make those comments. We'll go for a little while, and then you're going to vote. You're going to decide which side won. After we've decided that, we'll have a brief period for discussion where we encourage you to tell the students why you were or were not persuaded by their arguments, because that's wonderful feedback for them. They're not only future citizens interested in the common defense, but they're people who want to debate many issues and sharpen their skills at doing that, and that's why they're here. And then we'll call it quits. And I just think this is a fantastic initiative. I welcome these wonderful young people that are giving up their evening here, and Dr. Seatman and her assistant Brittany, whose last name I can't remember. But you're all very welcome here at Cantini, and we're very excited about this experiment in civic engagement on military affairs. So welcome to Cantini, and Dr. Seatman, I'll turn it over to you.
Good evening. As he mentioned, I am Rebecca Seatman, and it is my privilege to be with you all tonight and for my debaters to have the opportunity to speak about this issue, very controversial, but yet so important. At Wheaton College, our students participate in a style of debate called parliamentary debate, and so we will be primarily doing a parliamentary debate format tonight. The biggest difference is we don't have our topics in advance typically, so we typically find our topics out about 20 minutes before we have to debate them, which means we have to be very sharp on lots of different current events and things going on around the world and domestically. So tonight's debate was a little different for us in that we did have the topic ahead of time and were able to prepare, but we're very excited to present the arguments to you. The debate tonight is going to feature 4 of our students, and before I recognize them, I also want to thank you, not only Brittany Farrington, who Paul mentioned, but also the other assistant coaches who are here, Allison Niebauer and Joshua Melby. They have all 3 been fantastic assistants this year, and I'm very thankful to have their support and their participation in helping the students prepare for tonight. So in the parliamentary debate world, we have 2 teams, and the 2 teams represented before you. Let's see, on your left, okay, on your left is the opposition team, Dakota and Sarah. They will be defending the air-sea battle concept, and on your right, I had to think about this, Micah and Caitlin will be affirming the topic, which was set before as the United States federal government should rethink the air-sea battle doctrine. And so that's the side that they will defend, and they will be able to speak first as the government team, and we'll hear one speech from the government team followed by a speech from the opposition. So they'll go back and forth. So each speaker will have a speech. And then when those 4 speeches end, we'll move into the rebuttal phase of the debate round, where each side will have one opportunity in one speech to sort of crystallize their arguments and summarize what they've been talking about during the debate. One important feature of parliamentary debate is audience participation. And so I would like to encourage you to get involved during the debate tonight by showing your support or lack thereof for their arguments. So in the parliamentary debate world, we pound, so you can, do it like on your seat there. You can knock in some way, an affirming way. We also say hear, hear. That's also an affirmation of strong argument, good point. We also say for shame verbally when they make a ludicrous argument or do not back up their claims with adequate evidence and reasoning. And so feel free to for shame them if they do not make strong arguments, because I will for shame them right along with you. But when they are making a point that really resonates with you, it helps them to know that that's a strong point. So please respond by knocking or saying hear, hear. Without further ado, we will start the first debate, and between each speech, Brittany will get up and introduce each of the speakers a little bit more in depth.
All right, I just want to echo everything that Dr. Seatman said. We are so happy to be out at the First Division Museum today, and I think you have a treat in store for you. So your first speaker today, who's going to be the Prime Minister, so he's going to be the first speaker of the government team, is Micah Scaling. Micah is a pre-med student at Wheaton College, and fun fact about Micah, because I like to brag about him, he was a part of one of the top 50 teams in the country this year for debate. So he actually got accepted and got to attend the National Parliamentary Tournament of Excellence, which is pretty awesome. So give it up for Micah.
Thank you all for coming tonight. We hope you enjoyed our debate and find it to be educational and entertaining. The air-sea battle is understood as a doctrine that identifies China and Iran as a threat to the United States, and it simulates measures to prevent aggression from those two countries toward the United States. On the face of it, the Pentagon air-sea battle plan makes eminently good sense. It is a clear response to a clear challenge. But the nature of the document ultimately makes its implementation problematic and simply the wrong strategy for the job. Its employment entails, according to position papers developed to promote the doctrine, a blistering assault on China's mainland. And the document itself pictures China overtaking the globe on its cover. It gives explicit details about the step-by-step plan of attack to demolish the threat that China would pose in a war situation with the United States. And above all, air-sea battle is highly escalatory and is ridden with rhetoric that creates the very threats that it tries to suppress. Therefore, my partner and I stand resolved today that the United States federal government should rethink the implementation of the air-sea battle doctrine. And for clarification, throughout my speech, I will be referring to the air-sea battle as ASB as it is in the literature. And I will be supporting my position with one contention during my speech. Contention one is that the air-sea battle doctrine undercuts U.S. diplomatic strength. The first point to this is that the world is becoming increasingly more globalized and multipolar on all fronts. In other words, nations are working together to achieve greater goods on a grander scale than in the past. This can be seen especially through economic interconnectedness. China, South Korea, Japan, and the United States, for example, are all working together in discussing ways to improve economic ties with one another. This can be seen with multiple examples, one of which is the fourth installment of negotiations about a trilateral free trade agreement that is underway in the status quo, as well as efforts to expand the Trans-Pacific Partnership to include numerous other countries, including the United States and China. All of these are examples of increased economic interconnectedness and represent the fact that individual economies are increasingly becoming more connected and interdependent with one another in the world. And this creates the impetus for those countries to avoid any sort of conflict or any sort of belligerent action that they would take that could cause problems with the other countries with whom they do economic trade and have engagement. Additionally, the Middle East and Northern Africa is growing and gaining influence in the global economy and becoming a locus for either tensions or partnerships to arise, especially among larger superpower countries such as the United States and China. More than 66% of the world's proven oil reserves come from OPEC member countries within the Middle East, including countries like Iran, which the ASB identifies as a threat to the United States. Additionally, from 2009 to 2013, China ranked as the second largest oil importer in the world, behind the United States, of course. But in the last quarter of 2013, China, for the first time, surpassed the U.S. And this change is expected to be represented in every year's annual data starting this year. What this means is that multiple zones throughout the world are being created that could be the location of high possible tension and hotspots for conflicts to spark, or on the other hand, opportunities to begin negotiation and work towards diplomacy. And this creates an imperative for countries like the United States and China, who are in competition for these resources, to create policies that are not abrasive toward one another, but rather work to create pathways for that diplomacy and for negotiation. Another area in the world that we're seeing an increase in the amount of globalization and importance on multipolarity is through international cooperation on global conflicts. Organizations, of course, like the United Nations prove this very clearly and exist specifically to prevent unilateral growth of one particular power. But in order for their work to be effective, it requires cooperation among nations within it, and it requires an understanding of the instability that is caused when single powers act unilaterally and for their own personal goals. This can be seen on the UN Security Council, where their efforts often aren't able to make much progress when individual countries choose to take action contrary to the greater good that the Security Council tries to achieve. This was seen in Syria when China and Russia chose to veto intervention because they wanted to defend their personal assets at the expense of the greater good that the Security Council was trying to achieve. What this means is that in a world when globalization is becoming the norm and becoming the most strategic way for us to ensure stability and security, any sort of unilateral military growth, especially when it's forceful or aggressive in nature, is increasingly seen to be an example of belligerence by that individual country. And it represents efforts to maintain that unipolarity and cause insecurities. Today, my partner and I think that the Air-Sea Doctrine uniquely represents this sort of unipolar policymaking. It uses rhetoric within the document such as threats and enemies, and it constructs the concept of a conflict between the United States and China that is already existing and worsening. Specifically, the language within the document presents an inevitable scenario of war between the United States and China when it says, quote, "The adversary will initiate military activities with little or no indications or warning, and the adversary will attack U.S. and allied territories." This sort of rhetoric that is written throughout the document represents aggression rather than protection, and it posits the United States as having to build up its military and technological capacity in order to stay on top of China. Additionally, the document represents three primary stages that ASB attempts to achieve through the 3 Ds: disrupt, destroy, and defeat the adversary and its forces. And essentially, this sort of policymaking rhetoric seeks to instigate a campaign against China's networks and suppress their first strike systems, the very systems that China has identified as merely a means to deter actual threats to them. In this way, we think that they are acting no different than any other global hegemon in history who is likely to have some aggressor dislike them. This means that the United States taking action via the ASB could easily become that real threat to China if we instigate conflagratory action, whereas absent ASB policy, we would live in a world where, just like the United States, China has systems in place to protect itself by disincentivizing a first strike against them by rogue actors or some sort of actor that dislikes them. Additionally, a common argument in favor of ASB is that it is only a concept, not a strategy or plan of action or a doctrine. But unfortunately, this is not the case, as proven by military action themselves. In 2011, the Secretary of Defense endorsed ASB as a necessary first step in dealing with China's programs, and he directed the services to continue to develop ASB. Consequently, an executive committee was charged with implementing ASB, and the committee established 2020 as the objective year to have completed this concept and have it implemented in the military forces. What this ultimately means is that in a world that is focusing on globalization and working to achieve security and peace through that means, and when the United States takes action that is unipolar, especially via force through the ASB, that ultimately defeats the purpose of the doctrine and the ends that it tries to achieve. Power projection is good, and we think that to an extent the United States will always have to do it to some amount, but there's always going to be a difference between possessing the capacity to defend oneself and carrying out acts of overt aggression that appear to be attempts to remain the dominant power. The doctrine itself forces a strategy of perpetual counterbalancing on both sides, creating the very threat that it sought to prevent. And the ultimate flaw of the air-sea battle doctrine lies within its misperceptions that it creates and the misunderstandings that it sends to China, which ultimately send the wrong signals to China's leaders and create tensions that should not exist. Defense analyst Raoul Heinrich specifically warns that the deep mainland strikes that ASB enforces could easily be misconstrued in Beijing as an attempt at preemptively destroying China's retaliatory nuclear options. Under intense pressure, it would be hard to limit a dramatic escalation of such a conflict, including, in the worst case, up to and beyond the nuclear threshold. What Heinrich is showing us is that this sort of preemptive U.S. action under ASB could turn what would have been a limited conventional war with China into a nuclear conflict. In conclusion, the problem with ASB is that it is developing in a foreign policy vacuum. Thorough analysis has indicated that China simply has no intentions of using force or aggression that would warrant United States military action in the first place. This is seen through the fact that Beijing has actually embraced a foreign policy of peaceful development. They participate in the United Nations, where they often vote absent rather than exercising veto power, and they play by the World Trade Organization's rules, as well as using legitimate channels to resolve most recent trade and territorial disputes. Additionally, as represented by Amitai Etzioni, who was a former advisor to the Carter White House, he states that the United States and China have surprisingly many complementary interests that could serve as the basis for cooperative relations, including counterterrorism, economic stability, preventing the spread of pandemics, and environmental protection, which are all reasons why we should avoid any sort of conflict or belligerence with China. And even if a clash with China is a possibility, there's always alternative options that are less risky to ASB that the United States should employ prior to a risky option such as that. For example, they could implement a sort of a policy similar to the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty between the US and the USSR, something similar to mutually assured restraint. In contrast, however, air-sea battle not only makes war with China more likely, but it shifts attention and resources from where they are needed most, suppressing the ongoing threat of terrorism in the Middle East and Africa and contributing to nation building at home. So rather than causing China to think that we want to disrupt, destroy, and defeat them through the ASB doctrine, we need to focus on improving cooperation and economic relations, which will ensure mutual long-term safety.
All right, next we have the leader of the opposition team, who is Dakota Anderson. He'll be here to defend the air-sea battle concept. Dakota is a business major at Wheaton College, and he's a first-year debater. I think you're going to hear a great speech.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by presenting some counter-arguments to what my opponent has brought up. The air-sea battle concept is not an offensive strategy. Rather, it is a concept designed to ensure the freedom of international trade and the efficacy of U.S. diplomatic relations through coordinated United States air and naval forces. First, let's take a look at their overview. Our opponents refer to the air-sea battle concept as a blistering assault on China's mainland, a step-by-step plan of attack to demolish the threat China would pose in a war situation, saying that this makes it a highly escalatory and rhetoric-ridden threat that creates the very threat that it tries to suppress. However, we see that this is simply not the case. This is a misunderstanding of the air-sea battle concept. The air-sea battle concept focuses on analyzing the U.S. response to multiple scenarios and the breadth of foreign capabilities. According to Commander David Foreman of the U.S. Navy, when the Pentagon officially released its air-sea battle concept in 2011, and later in May 2013, China was not even mentioned specifically. How can this be, you say? Our opponents have confused the air-sea battle concept with the Asia-Pacific rebalance, which does mention China specifically. Though China possesses many capable weapons, the air-sea battle concept analyzes the breadth of foreign capabilities, even low-level tactics, such as swarming small boats. With China's economy projected by some to overtake that of the United States by 2030, China cannot be ignored in air-sea battle concept discussions. Additionally, several key partners and allies, such as Japan, Australia, South Korea, Singapore, and Malaysia, are keenly interested in the full U.S. intent of the air-sea battle concept. Both civilian and military leaders are using the concept to reassure U.S. partners and allies of continued U.S. presence in the region. China is also currently increasing its use of anti-access area denial, called A2AD in affectionate government acronyms, excuse me. Anti-access area denial is a strategy where a given power uses its forces to limit the international trade and access to a given area. We see this demonstrated in China's no-fly zone in the East China Sea. This, coupled with the fact that China has recently increased its development of anti-ship missiles, leads to the real threat of China having the capability to shut down trade in the area in a similar way to Iran and its threat of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, where 80% of the world's seaborne oil travels on its way from OPEC countries to the rest of the world. The air-sea battle concept specifically focuses on preventing A2AD strategies in order to protect the freedom of trade through denying these countries air and sea superiority and ensuring a quick response towards any attempts to deny international trade. An obvious step in the process of developing a future military is to assess the current relative strengths of peers and potential adversaries. The Chinese have significant capabilities, and so of course, they're considered in some of the air-sea battle concept discussions. But using a highly capable military as an assessment benchmark is a far cry from what the most common misconception is, that this is going to be a full-scale invasion of China's mainland. For example, China recently developed the DF-21 medium-range ballistic missile, which is the first anti-ship missile developed in China. However, the Pentagon evaluates this weapon based on its capability, that it's an anti-ship missile, not based on who currently owns it. China has recently become one of the top 5 military arms exporters, and decades ago, Chinese sold ballistic missiles to Saudi Arabia. However, currently they are limiting its transfer of missile technology. But as standard strategic planning, the Department of Defense considers worst-case scenarios, even if they're very low probability. And frankly, I'm grateful for that. It's preferable to at least be knowledgeable of the worst-case scenario than to be blindsided by a perfect storm of events. The Obama administration does not support a containment policy for China, and the DoD is conscious of the security dilemma inherent in preparing for these contingencies without causing an arms race. So it purposefully does not focus solely on China. In fact, in a show of amity, the DoD invited China to participate in the Rim of the Pacific, which is a large multinational naval exercise that's going to be held in Pearl Harbor later this year. Furthermore, they paint the rhetoric of the Obama Doctrine's pivot towards the Asia-Pacific to be provocative and likely to induce conflict. They ignore, however, the fact that the very nature of such rhetoric is what's been able to suppress conflict in the area thus far. So we are able to see that the air-sea battle concept is not the highly escalatory, rhetoric-ridden strategy that the opposing team would like you to think. Rather, it's a carefully thought-out reassessment of our military capabilities in the world stage. In addition to this, the air-sea battle doctrine allows the U.S. to better utilize its diplomatic relations and economic pressure in an international context. Ben Rhodes, the Obama administration's deputy of National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications, was quoted in Foreign Policy magazine as saying, "We will use force unilaterally against direct threats to the United States, and will use force in a very precise way." Crises the administration deems indirect threats towards the United States, such as the uprisings in Libya and Syria, are quote-unquote threats to global security. Rhodes argued, and will be responded to multilaterally, and not necessarily by force. The drawdown of U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the creation of a smaller, more agile U.S. military spread across Asia, the Pacific, and the Middle East, are also a part of the doctrine. So is the discreet backing of protesters in Egypt, Iran, and Syria. Libya is an example of where the U.S. was able to use its air-sea naval forces effectively as a hegemonic power to increase the effectiveness of its multilateral initiatives. President Obama, with regards to Libya, explains, quote, "It is true that America cannot use our military wherever repression occurs. And given the costs and risks of interventions, we must always measure our interests against the need for action. But that cannot be an argument for never acting on behalf of what's right. In Libya, we were faced with the prospect of violence on a horrific scale. We had a unique ability to stop that violence. We had the ability to stop Gaddafi's forces in their tracks without putting American troops on the ground. To brush aside America's responsibility as a leader, and more profoundly, our responsibilities to our fellow human beings under such circumstances, would have been a betrayal of who we are." Now, the conditions that allowed the U.S. to intervene in Libya are certainly not the case in every instance. However, the French and United States naval and air intervention in the case of Libya did help the people to overthrow their government instead of the direct overthrow of a foreign military. All of this contributes to the basic idea that the Obama Doctrine involves avoiding military intervention in all circumstances unless it's a direct threat to the United States. So the idea of the air-sea battle concept being an instigator of conflict is simply not the case because we've already committed to not using military intervention unless it's a direct threat to us. However, recognition of the perception of power has led Obama to expand peaceful military presence and spending to ensure the efficacy of America's diplomatic relations and economic pressure. So, as we saw in the international mandate to stop the violence in Libya. The example of Libya is a direct example of how hegemony is necessary, effective, and possible through a focus on the air-sea force as opposed to a large standing military. In conclusion, the air-sea battle concept is the most effective means to protect international trade and the efficacy of U.S. diplomatic relations.
All right, here to try to turn the tides back for the government team is Caitlin Smith. She's going to be your member of government in today's debate round. She is a philosophy and math double major at Wheaton College, and I think you'll enjoy her speech.
Okay, thanks to everybody for being here today. We're really excited to get this chance to debate for you. So my speech is going to address most of the points that were made by my opponent. First, I'm going to be talking about what he said specifically about our rhetoric towards China, and then talking about the contention that he proposed on U.S. diplomatic power. Finally, I will propose an additional contention for the government team entitled ASB Doctrine Decreases U.S. Military Power. On to the first point. Our opponents make 2 points about China specifically. The first being that we're merely assessing the threat that China is, and secondly, that we aren't only talking about China with the ASB doctrine. On this first point of assessing the threat, our opponents make the argument that we have to know what this threat is, and that that's just good policy. Well, I would argue that we should know what threats are. If the way that we do so is by creating a doctrine that's actually going to be creating those threats and hurting the individual people of the United States, that's probably going to be the worst way possible to assess a threat. Based on my partner's first contention, the entire point and advocacy of the government team is that the ASB doctrine is exactly the trigger toward creating these kinds of problems with China that it seeks to solve. Therefore, we aren't just assessing a threat. We are showing that we are going to be aggressive against China, and that is what's going to cause the real threat to exist. Therefore, we cannot look to the ASB doctrine. The second point that my opponents make, though, is that we aren't just talking about China with the ASB doctrine. I'd like to point out that neither my partner nor myself believe that it just deals with China. Rather, we argue that our argumentation about China is merely to point out that China was the most egregious example of how wrong this doctrine is. The reality is that if this doctrine is bad, it doesn't matter what country we're applying it to. Because if it's a bad concept, then it's going to be bad in all situations. We argue that, therefore, we argue that our argumentation to the bad effects of ASB applies regardless of what specific country we look to. If it's a bad concept, then it's bad when it's applied to any country. Furthermore, classic power projection is not working. We can't continue to beat everybody up and expect like nothing's going to happen to us. The fact that we're fighting a war on terror right now shows that power projection itself isn't working. The fact is that in the current world, it's not about who has the biggest military. It's about who's able to get to us. Because if we continue to beat everybody up, they're only going to be looking for ways to come back at us. If we are making ourselves into the perceived aggressor toward other countries, then they're going to be looking to get at us, and that's going to be the way that conflicts are going to be instigated, not by us not projecting enough power. Furthermore, if we want to increase our relations and have the power that the U.S. has diplomatically, then we need to look good on an international level. Therefore, we move on to their arguments on diplomatic relations. Essentially, our opponents are arguing that because we have such good power projection and diplomatic relations with other countries, that we are able to not necessarily put people on the ground when we want to help people in need, that we're able to project that kind of power, that we don't have to intervene physically. Well, my partner and I, believe that this is a good thing. Our argumentation is that ultimately ASB is going to decrease this capacity. Again, look to my example of a bully. If we're perceived as an aggressor, that's not going to help us be able to make other people agree with us, or be able to have these kinds of interventions. Currently, even though we are able to prevent conflict, we can't do this in the future without our diplomatic relations, which are thoroughly undercut by ASB. Basically, we agree that the U.S. needs to have diplomatic power, but because of this, we argue that ASB is the worst possible doctrine, because ultimately it undercuts the U.S.'s ability to relate to others diplomatically. Furthermore, the mere presence of problems internationally that we need to use U.S. diplomatic power for is not in itself an argument as to why ASB is the best means or even the necessary means to solve for it. Given our expansive reasons for why ASB is a problem and undercuts the U.S.'s diplomatic power, other methods would be preferable, especially if we have the goal of ultimately increasing the U.S.'s diplomatic power. Ultimately, the argument that we are making is not that ASB is directly causing specific attacks, but we are arguing that perception is everything. If we are seen by China or by other international or by other nations as an aggressor, then that's going to be the thing that's going to decrease our diplomatic power and lead to all the bad things that my partner talked about. We don't argue that ASB is causing attacks right now. We argue that it makes us look very bad, and that this will ultimately be bad both domestically and internationally. Now I will propose a new contention entitled ASB Decreases U.S. Military Power. The first point under this is that the ASB doctrine, through its focus on naval power and the Air Force in the Western Pacific and Persian Gulf, is already affecting U.S. economic policy. The first point under this is that because it focuses on the Western Pacific and the Persian Gulf, it emphasizes the importance of these forces in the region to achieve its intended goals, including supposedly securing trade and sea routes and regulating resources within them. Therefore, it directly creates new priorities for the U.S. budget. In fact, it has already physically affected the budget of the fiscal years 2014 to 2018 by shifting spending towards the sort of electronic, cyber, and anti-submarine weapon systems that the war plan for China calls for. Chief Naval Operations Admiral Jonathan Greenert stated that the ASB doctrine has more than 200 initiatives in progress, and that the 2011 and 2012 presidential budgets included related investments in anti-submarine warfare, electronic warfare, air and missile defense, and information sharing. Furthermore, the 2013 presidential budget kept these investments going. Because of this, the specific action being taken by ASB causes a trade-off of military assets and forces. This trade-off is triggered by economic realities and by the perception that it creates domestically. First, on the point about the economy. The 2011 Budget Control Act returned the defense budget to what it was in the early 2000s and put a cap on it. Therefore, there is no more money in the U.S. budget toward ASB initiatives. Therefore, something has to go. People involved in the military are aware of this, as many Army members have seen ASB as an attempt by the Air Force and Navy to grab future missions and a large share of the shrinking defense budget. Furthermore, in the eyes of the U.S. public, the ASB doctrine causes us to not care as much about troops. It makes us see the Army as less important than the initiatives of ASB. This means that the Army will be the specific thing cut under the ASB doctrine mindset. This will affect the amount of people that are in the Army, as, in lieu of future impending sequestrian cuts, the Army is already having to look to cut over 100,000 troops from their numbers. This not only weakens their capacity to function, but it perpetuates the already perceived shift away from this branch and negates their importance. This also will cause closures of bases, because bases that wouldn't be strategically key to ASB would be seen as unnecessary. This means that likely closures will include a number of bases in the Middle East, including Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, which is home to hundreds of U.S. NATO-owned nuclear weapons critical to maintaining strong relations with our NATO ally, Turkey, as well as security in the region, as well as in Afghanistan, Kuwait, and a number of our installations in Germany and our other European allies, many of which were already scheduled to close down by 2015. Ultimately, these decreases in the military will cause many bad things, as our military is key to doing many of the things that the U.S. does internationally. When we close down these bases specifically and decrease our standing military, this is going to harm the economies, the relations, and the security of the regions in which those initiatives were involved, and will also affect the individual troops, meaning that tens of thousands of military members will lose their jobs. Furthermore, troops have been key in implementing humanitarian aid specifically, and if we take these away, we are not going to have as great effectiveness in these initiatives. Finally, troops have been key in counterinsurgency efforts, and therefore are very important in the fight that we have against terrorism. All of this means that ASB will, due to the economic realities of the U.S. and the perception that it creates domestically, create a decrease in the military power of the U.S. to the detriment of U.S. citizens, society, and many people internationally.
All right, next up, our member of the opposition is Sarah Newbaum. Sarah is studying political science and economics at Wheaton College, and she is also a member of the Wheaton Army ROTC, so I'm sure she'll have some special insight into this topic for us. So welcome, Sarah.
All right, let's get started. Defense spending and its allocation is one of the most controversial budget issues the United States has faced in the past few years. In response to the arguments my opponents have made, we will now discuss the size of the military under the air-sea battle concept, the focus on domestic strength, the effect on soldiers that the air-sea battle concept will have, and the effect on foreign policy. First, exactly how will the air-sea battle concept affect the size of the military? While it can certainly be argued that the amount of personnel in the military should be maintained, the air-sea battle concept does not decrease the size of the standing army all that much. It lowers the total number of military personnel 19% from current levels. However, current levels are 14% higher than they were 10 years ago. This means that, in reality, we would only be seeing a 5% decrease from previous peacetime levels. And while the military is shrinking only slightly, the bigger change is allocation of persons. Let's talk about domestic control. My opponents argue that decreasing the defense budget and closing bases around the world would ultimately undermine the military's ability to function and the appearance of its importance. However, they ignore the fact that in the status quo, joint branch operations are important for more than budgetary reasons. Inter-branch and interagency coordination are essential in order to cultivate intelligence and strategies effective to secure our borders. Additionally, bases are being built and expanded on U.S. soil, diminishing the need for bases abroad. One of the things that the air-sea battle concept focuses on is how U.S. bases overseas are increasingly a threat to U.S. security. The air-sea battle concept realizes that an old strategy is not what is needed in modern times. This is not the wrong strategy. It's a new and improved strategy responding agilely to new threats. One facet of domestic control expansion includes the growth of technological sectors in the military. With increased technology and technological threats, the military bases that focus on cybersecurity and cyber threats will continue to expand. Retired Admiral James Stavridis says in an editorial published in the U.S. Naval Institute's Proceedings magazine that despite the centralized Cyber Command headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland, the 5 services also have their own service-specific cyber operation. This model undercuts national security in at least 2 ways. It encourages unhealthy competition between services, and it thwarts the development of universal standards. A single, standalone force, essentially its own branch, independent of the others, would eliminate these problems. A new, dedicated cyber force would allow branches to work together, improving security and making budgetary sense, eliminating the redundancy that comes from each branch of service having its own cyber assets. That's right, there's currently a debate over whether or not an entirely new branch should be added to the military to address cyber needs. This branch would be entirely domestic. It would be a common-sense response of the military to the evolving domain of threats to the United States and would grow the military's overall influence drastically in order to further diplomatic relations and economic presence. This links into the air-sea battle concept because it deals with the focus on a more technological and removed approach to conflict. Such an approach, whether or not it involves a whole new branch, would create many domestic military jobs and that would require increasingly more skill, meaning that fewer, more specialized personnel will handle the job more effectively and with more efficiency. One of the main problems people have with bureaucracy is its inability to change with the times. By developing our technological abilities, overall, compacting of a smaller, more skilled military, we are proving that we can adjust to new threats and modernize our foreign policy approach. Bases and troops may have been necessary in Vietnam and Korea, but the very nature of current threat deems it absolutely necessary for the U.S. to alter its past approach and creatively reorganize in order to be adequately prepared for future conflict, or hopefully a lack thereof. The air-sea battle concept will not hurt the overall capabilities of the U.S. military, but does significantly reorganize it, which leads me to my next point. Now let's move on to discussing how the air-sea battle concept removes soldiers from harm's way. reducing the prominence of bases, the intervention of soldiers directly into armed conflict, and adjusting to place more soldiers in non-threatening situations where they can more effectively and efficiently combat threats are tenets on which the air-sea battle concept is based. The troops that do remain abroad will be involved in a more cultural capacity, able to focus on infrastructure and partnering with other countries instead of direct intervention. So how is this beneficial? First of all, taking soldiers directly out of the line of fire saves lives. Second of all, it reduces mental disorders associated with the trauma of being a soldier currently, including post-traumatic stress disorder and suicides. A study conducted for Congress by the Rand Corporation finds that 20% of the 2.3 million veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have post-traumatic stress disorder. Preliminary figures suggest that being a veteran now roughly doubles one's risk of suicide. For young men ages 17 to 24, being a veteran almost quadruples the risk of suicide, according to a study in the American Journal of Public Health. The New York Times reports that in June of 2012, there were more active duty military suicides than casualties. In fact, here's a window into the tragedy within the American military. For every soldier killed on the battlefield this year, about 25 veterans are dying from their own hands. An American soldier dies every day and a half on average in Iraq or Afghanistan. Veterans kill themselves at a rate of 1 every 80 minutes. More than 6,500 veteran suicides are logged every year, more than the total number of soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan since those wars began. Furthermore, the International Business Times reported in November that the number of non-fatal casualties in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars has reached a grim milestone of 1 million injuries. What is even more troubling is that an increasing number of veterans never receive disability benefits or receive them far too late. As of May 20th, the Department of Veteran Affairs had over 800,000 claims waiting to be processed. 2/3 of those claims, almost 600,000 of them, have been pending for over 125 days and have been classified as backlogged. An additional 250,000 claim appeals are pending from veterans who believe the Veteran Affairs Committee ruled incorrectly on their initial claims. The average wait time for a claim to be completed is 345 days, but appeals can take much longer. While veterans wait for their claims to be processed so that they can cover health care expenses, many see their medical conditions worsen. Nearly 20,000 veterans have died while waiting for their disability claims to be processed. That's about 53 dead soldiers per day. That's about 3 times the number of U.S. casualties from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Removing soldiers from the front lines in other countries will significantly reduce the number of soldiers who die in combat, those who die waiting for disability coverage, and those who die at their own hands as a result of war-related stress. Millions of men and women sacrifice so much for the United States, and the United States must also work to keep these men and women as safe as they can be. The air-sea battle concept allows soldiers to be removed from other countries without sacrificing national security or even national interests. This leads me to my next point, which is the effect of the air-sea battle concept on foreign peoples and nations. While the air-sea battle concept is geared towards keeping U.S. personnel safe, it also works to limit the violence and cultural intrusion in foreign nations, greatly reducing anti-American sentiment. Dr. Ivan Eland from George Washington University explains that terrorists attack the United States for what it does: exercise political and military power overseas to intervene in the affairs of other nations. He has documented over 60 terrorist incidents directed at the U.S., linking them directly to interventionist foreign policy. And the more direct the intervention, the more likely the U.S. is to garner anti-American sentiment. U.S. intervention of military forces has been far more successful without significant ground forces than the other way around. For example, public approval of the U.S. in Pakistan and Iraq is not extremely widespread, whereas it is much higher in Libya, where, while we did intervene, it was a much less direct fashion. Following Benghazi, thousands of counter-protesters flooded the streets rallying for America. By removing invasive troops and adjusting the focus to simply facilitating economic growth, we set up a framework for democracy, political partnerships, and peace instead of instigating an us-against-them mentality, or appearing, as my opponents argue, as an aggressor, and dividing polities in a way that may or may not be beneficial to the development of the country or presenting armed conflict. Furthermore, ensuring trade routes stay open actually keeps countries prosperous and avoids the economic inequality that is one of the main factors that drives people into terrorism and perpetuates anti-American sentiment. By supporting infrastructure and trade while contributing to, but not single-handedly taking on security, the air-sea battle doctrine fully allows the U.S. to develop good relationships with countries while maintaining security by addressing the root cause, something that past foreign policy has failed to do. In regards to China, the main way they have lashed out against the United States thus far has often been through countries like Pakistan and Iran. This demonstrates that the most real and present danger to the U.S. is still involved with the Middle East. By strengthening our relations in these areas, we greatly limit the harm that China can cause us. The bottom line when it comes to foreign relations and the air-sea battle concept is that my opponents are right when they speak about the importance of economic interdependence and diplomacy. Perception of U.S. strength and ability to protect and promote freedom is imperative to its ability to actually do so. The air-sea battle concept allows us to accomplish this with minimal risk. The accumulative effect of these aspects will paint the U.S. as a benign superpower, but one that does have the capacity to defend itself, this being the ideal role of the U.S. Looking back, it is clear that for the sake of the lives and well-being of U.S. soldiers, citizens of foreign nations, and the U.S. populace on a whole, it is essential that the air-sea battle concept remain intact. Thank you.
All right, so this has marked the end of our 4 constructive speeches in the debate, which means that now we're going to transition into the rebuttal stages. These are going to be shorter speeches, and the goal is to crystallize their arguments and really win you over, make their one last appeal for you to vote for them at the end of the debate. So doing that for the government team is Micah Scaling to give you one last appeal.
In a world absent of ASB doctrine, we have an opportunity to gain an economic partner and an opportunity to be able to influence China's policymaking in a positive way. But if we continue to treat China like a bully, we will get into a fight with them. A focal point of this debate is what ASB actually does. Many of the opposition's key arguments rest on the presumption that ASB is merely a concept meant to represent our commitment to the Asian-Pacific region and our resolve to defend ourselves and what we think is right. However, it is not a matter of what we think ASB is or what it's supposed to do, but rather what matters is what China perceives of it, because that is going to determine the implications of our actions and of our policymaking. Also, empirically, the fact that the military is using ASB for more than just a discussion topic, as evidenced by the fact that they have established a deadline of 2020 to have the mandates of ASB fully functional, represents the fact that we need to treat this seriously, just as China will treat it seriously when they see that we are using this to bolster our military. This means that ASB is likely being evaluated as more than just a concept, but rather as a strategy or a doctrine, not unlike its predecessors, such as the air-land doctrine that we enforced in Vietnam. And even if that is not what we intend for it to be, it is perceived by China as such. And this scenario that ASB creates with China has been likened to that of the Cuban Missile Crisis because of the aggressive nature and the likelihood to cause a miscalculation. Any policy that risks this should be rejected in a world where security is already being better achieved by enforcing multipolarity and international cooperation, rather than individual superpower nations equipped with the greatest militaries trying to play king of the hill. There will always be safer alternative options, especially in a world where China has done nothing to provoke a policy that looks like the United States is preparing for a first strike. We do affirm the importance of being informed of existing threats, which China is to the United States in the status quo, but that does not require us adopting a caustic foreign policy that causes that very threat to materialize. Additionally, the opposition in Dakota's first speech, he argued that hegemony is important and that perception of power is crucial for the United States. We agree that hegemony is important, and to project that sort of power is critical for the United States to ensure its stance in the world. But we do so through diplomacy, cooperation, and discussion in the modern-day world, and that must come first. My arguments respond to his directly and show that ASB threatens our ability to have diplomacy with nations like China or those in the Middle East when we have guns pointed at them. In today's international policy-making realm, we are only able to become safer and prove to be stronger against rogue states when we work cooperatively, not alone. Additionally, my partner's second key argument that she made as to why we should rethink ASB was articulated very clearly when she explained how ASB is going to actually decrease our military power, probably the very thing that we don't want to happen in a conflict with China. The political climate has already and will probably continue to pressure policymakers to make cuts in the military, and this is going to cause a trade-off and a shift in the focus in a direction that we don't want it to go. It will cause more emphasis to be placed on ASB, and that means fewer foreign bases, tens of thousands of Army members cut, and a decrease in our Army's capacity to function. The opposition even stated that ASB is going to decrease the total number of military personnel by 19%. Cutting the United States military personnel by almost 1/5 is almost inevitably going to be problematic for our ability to be able to respond to problems or conflicts when they arise. Our opponents also argued that technological advancements and the technological sector is becoming more prevalent within the military and their ability to function. And this may be true, but it does not warrant cutting our current numbers of soldiers who are key to ensuring security and stability. Additionally, we are always going to need actual troops as part of any strategy, whether it is a new strategy or an old one. Therefore, we need to always ensure that we still have a focus and an emphasis on the importance of their role in a military situation. Additionally, look to the fact that ASB does not affect our ability to make decisions toward placing a greater focus towards cyber warfare. Our opponents argued that with this shift, we also need to make a transition in the types of military power that we enforce. But again, what this means is that the United States military will put efforts towards cybersecurity and cyber warfare if that is where it needs to go. That does not necessitate a cut in the numbers of troops, as we've shown and articulated clearly the importance that they will always have in our capacity to act and function. Additionally, our opponents make compelling arguments regarding the severity of PTSD and suicide risk among soldiers, but we must recognize that ASB is not the answer to this problem. Yes, it may decrease the number of troops, therefore reducing the potential number of our soldiers exposed to traumatic events, but what happens when ASB provokes a conflict or another issue arises in the world that requires a surge in our troop numbers? ASB is not the solution to the problem in any way. Rather, the issue lies with how we deal with PTSD and suicide as a culture when our soldiers get home. ASB does not solve for those root causes, and we cannot use that as a justification to implement this program. ASB does not solve for those backlogs. It will not solve for the poor conditions or the waiting times for disability claims, and it may actually contribute to that if it instigates a conflict that requires us sending in troops. Also, we cannot forget the atrocities that are committed on civilians who are unwillingly put into harm's way when we have to use heavy weaponry because ASB requires us to in a war situation. Under these circumstances, we have to recognize that when dealing with these sorts of issues and when looking at the implications such as PTSD, ASB is not the way to solve for this, and it will worsen the situation. Our opponents also argued that that ASB would decrease anti-American sentiment compared to what current troops on the ground cause. While there's no question that troops on the ground do probably cause a certain level of anti-American sentiment as seen empirically in the Middle East, we also have to recognize, again, that ASB would increase that anti-American sentiment, probably in more threatening and aggressive ways than what we've seen in the past. By demonizing whole nations and labeling them as an imminent threat to the United States, it is not likely that we will be improving our reputation with the government or with the government's citizens. And ASB is what is going to construct that very us-them dichotomy that demonizes the other and separates us from being able to work cooperatively with them. In conclusion, the status quo provides us an opportunity to where we can improve economic relations with China and countries in the Middle East. It allows us to focus on international cooperation and stability and ensure that we have a powerful military force of skilled Army members that have the capacity to establish boots on the ground. ASB puts all of these in jeopardy, and there is too much at stake to risk losing what already ensures our safety just to implement a policy like ASB that turns potential allies into enemies and paints the United States as a superpower bent on destruction for only our own personal gain.
All right, and now to give us the very last speech of the round, the leader of opposition is going to come back up and give his rebuttal. So please welcome Dakota Anderson.
Good evening, everybody. Sounds like you all have some pretty strong opinions on this, so I'm going to keep this short, sweet, and to the point, and that way we can hear what you have to say. Looking forward to it. I'd like to begin by stating that my partner and I would love to live in the world of the government team, a world where all nations work together altruistically in harmony and don't threaten the global economic security. But ladies and gentlemen, that's not the world that we live in. The world that we live in is the real world, where China, Iran, and other world powers threaten our global security and our most precious commodity, freedom. The air-sea battle concept ensures that we can all live in a world that is safe, economically prosperous, and free. They've stated that perception matters, but what perception does it give others when we fail to adequately protect ourselves for fear of what they will think? As the air-sea battle concept protects the freedom of trade globally, which allows for the increased prosperity of everyone, not allowing countries to limit trade in their area and be a bully and so limit the prosperity. They say that we should cooperate and be multilateral, but as we've seen with the Libya example, the air-sea battle concept increases the efficacy of U.S. diplomatic relations and economic pressure. They say that this will be a decrease in military power. This is simply false. A 21st century world calls for a 21st century strategy. No longer are foreign bases the strength that they were back in the Cold War era when they were developed. Rather, they have become a vulnerability, more susceptible to terrorist attacks and corruption. Large land forces increase anti-American sentiment, which, as we've seen empirically in the Middle East, leads to an increase in terrorism and attacks against U.S. interests in those areas. Cybertech is America's Achilles heel, with over 90 attacks per day on Washington from Beijing. Air-sea battle concept solves for all of these and makes our military stronger, faster, and more adaptable in this rapidly changing world. The air-sea battle concept also decreases the number of soldiers put at risk with their boots on the ground in wartime scenarios, thus decreasing the amount of PTSD and casualties. Also, the effectiveness of our military's power projection decreases the amount of wars that we'll actually have to fight, the amount of soldiers' lives that we'll actually have to risk, because this concept shows that we are prepared to respond to any given threat, and so it will reduce the amount of wars that we actually have to go and fight. At the end of the day, you have a choice: to live in the world where the U.S. answers growing global threats with antiquated strategies and wishful thinking, or a world where the U.S. fulfills its burdens to protect global security and ensure that freedom continues to be the watchword of humanity.
Okay, so that concludes the formal debate. I thought it was absolutely superb. My head hurts from trying to keep up with sort of the rapid fire list of arguments and evidence and red herrings and so on and so forth. But I think they all deserve a further round of applause just for doing that. Wait for a microphone because this is all taped, and JD's got the microphones in the back, but let's take a few minutes for questions or comments, and please direct them to our panelists who are the experts on this subject.
Well, thank you. I have kind of a generic question because I'm new to this whole debating thing, and I really enjoyed your presentation tonight. You guys are fabulous, and I'm just thrilled to see young people coming along like yourselves and so capable. My generic question is, were you all selected to be on your specific team because of your passion for your side, or could you just as easily have switched and been placed to argue the counterpoints?
Hey, J.D.
For this debate specifically, and I guess it's the nature of parliamentary debate that we have to be prepared to debate either side. At tournaments that we go to, we don't know the topic or what side we're on until 20 minutes before the round starts. And so similarly with this debate, we kind of just we're picked or put onto one side as opposed to another, unless Coach picked, yeah.
I did have one other, and that is just, this is a comment, I'm noticing that in many cases, and I don't know that this means anything, but you on the far right, you were probably best at more frequently talking in terms of we, when you're talking about we, your team, rather than I against the opponents. Many times the others were I, and my opponent, rather than our opponent. It's just a small point, but something I noticed.
Good job.
There's J.D., there's a question in the back from a gentleman in the audience, and then we'll come up to this one in the front.
Thank you. I enjoyed all of you working and recognize that academically, if you guys are on your speech teams in college or debate teams, you have to do some things similar, unless they just grab you out of the hallways to come here and do this. But it was really interesting to watch how each one of you handled the situation. It was just, from my standpoint, it was just a very enjoyable presentation, because each of you exhibited a certain amount of expertise. And, you're talking to a lot of old people here who, can't give you any vote. We can't, say, yeah, you guys are going to win the tournament, Thank you.
Gentleman up here.
Trust me, I do not need a microphone. No, we need it for the...
We need it for you to be picked up on it.
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for your honor and courage to stand up here and debate and take on a topic that actually really means a lot to the global community, which people probably don't realize. Most of these are going to be suggestions more than questions, but when you first introduced the air-sea battle, you mentioned China and Iran, but yet you only used Iran one time. You used the word Middle East. And so that brings into thought, what is the concept, what is the strategy? To the Prime Minister, first and foremost, you mentioned the UN, but yet the UN is full of corruption and weakness, as we've seen in counterinsurgency campaigns in East Timor, and more specifically in Liberia, okay? We talk about the UN, but yet we forget about the World Bank and the IMF, which are more involved when it comes to the economic, political reforms that are needed. To you, ma'am, you had mentioned the only person who did, which I'm going to get to my point, is counterinsurgency, but you mentioned terrorism. And we have to remember that insurgents and terrorism can be different, and a lot of times in this global age they are. Specifically, you mentioned China, but what we forgot to mention as well is that China is fighting its own counterinsurgency that most people know nothing about, which is the Uyghurs out of the Xinjiang province, which is strategically close to a lot of the stands, because I don't know all the stands in the world, so. But now an argument against the ASB. Specifically mentioned Ben Rhodes, who Ben Rhodes was involved in the Iraq campaign, and we all know how that turned out. So I don't think using him would be a good example, but we use this term model, and that seems to be used in the military term, this model, like it's some cookie cutter thing, like what works here works there. We tried it in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it doesn't work. So using the word model I don't think is appropriate. And we talk about strategy and concept, but we forget about tactics. We can talk about doctrine all we want, but yet without the tactics and the boots on the ground, nothing is going to succeed without those guys in the mission. And we see that all the time. What you put on paper is different than when you go to war. But specifically, I'll just end with this because I don't want to take up too much time. I think we're forgetting the overlining theme, and I forget which one of you all said it, but you said that the ASB is a new strategy. It may be a new strategy, but with old war thinking. We've been at war now for 14 years with thousands of lives lost and trillions of dollars. The fact is we will not be in a major battle for another 15 to 20 years because we need to figure out what went wrong. But what we will fight is counterinsurgency, where we're invited by the host nations, which basically is going to be small advisors. Small teams of advisors working with indigenous forces to bring about the reforms that are needed. However, there still has to be reforms from the political, economical, diplomatic standpoint. We mentioned Africa as one, but Africa is interesting because it is a very landlocked country. So you think about, we need the trade, which you need ships. But if you've got battles going on in Uganda, how does a country like South Sudan, which has all the oil reserve, get those across to Liberia to ship those to the States, to South America? You know, when we talk about China, we have to look at where they're operating, which is in Africa. So the ASB model should probably be more focused on Africa, since that's where the Chinese and U.S. strategic interests are. Thank you.
I'm going to try to get you guys to talk a little bit more now. What do you really, being the next generation, what do you see is the major threat to the United States?
Okay. I think that the major threat to the United States is probably going to be China, but I think something that we all agree upon outside of the debate world is that economic interdependence is something that's growing and something that's important to recognize. And I think the risk of armed conflict is decreasing just because we are so reliant on these other countries. Like China, almost half of their GDP is dependent on the export markets of the US, Japan, and South Korea. The reality is that the risk of armed conflict isn't extremely high, but the fact that we both have interests, extremely different interests, means that there's still going to be conflict, but it's not going to be direct. So I think that the biggest threat to the United States directly is probably going to have to do, again, like you were saying, with counterinsurgency right now, and countering terrorism and continuing to try to promote peace in a way that's not going to cause terrorism and addressing those root causes. So I think terrorism is still going to be the main threat. I don't foresee any large direct conflicts between the US and other countries.
I would like to agree with my partner as far as external threats go, but as far as just threat to the United States itself, it seems that one thing that often gets overlooked is the lack of political engagement of young people these days. Now, we're kind of a little bit of an exception, just a bit, but the thing that scares me most is talking to friends who are my age and them not knowing and honestly not caring about what's actually going on in the world.
Question here.
Thanks. This is to get back to the debate topic. First, I should tell you, by way of disclaimer, that I listen to a lot of debate for a living. I'm a lawyer, and I've also judged debate before. Let me begin by saying, first of all, that you each did an excellent job in terms of your oral presentation. It was easy to follow what you say, despite the number of topics you're dealing with. Very, very exceptionally smooth delivery, the best I've ever heard. And I'll say that, and I've listened to other college teams. However, an intelligent conversation, an intelligent debate begins, first of all, with defining what the topic is. And that's the courtroom side of it, right? Time is at a premium. And I found myself listening intently, trying to find out what ASB was. What were its essential characteristics? And it wasn't until we got to Caitlin's speech that we actually got any specifics as to what ASB doctrine had. Now that's 2 speeches into a debate before we get any specifics on what it is we're talking about. Now you did excellent jobs, all of you, in specifically attacking, rebutting, responding to points made by the preceding speaker. Refreshing, exciting. But the failure to identify what ASB was at the outset left the audience, in my opinion, running around after your speeches trying to pluck out what it was being debated. And I would encourage you, as you revise your speeches and prepare for higher levels of competition, to do that, and it will greatly empower you then as you move forward. Thanks.
noticed that you were talking about how removing people from the front lines has both good and bad sides. But what about if, say, a country were to spot this as a weakness and plan an attack that we weren't prepared for because we didn't have enough soldiers? What then?
Since that was my point. Okay, so to answer your question, the point of, well, what the air-sea battle doctrine does is it focuses on having the technology to deal with threats like that, and the fact that the idea is that we wouldn't need a large standing army to combat any threats. And if a country were to use an army to try to attack the United States, there are other measures that could be taken besides using the military. There's economic pressures, diplomatic pressures, there's sanctions, there's many options that can be explored. So the idea of the air-sea battle doctrine, or just general foreign policy, is that when a country does threaten the United States militarily, that we try to address it in other ways before resorting to the military. So reducing the standing army in other countries wouldn't necessarily make us more at risk.
Also, the air-sea battle doctrine and the reduction in the number of soldiers doesn't mean that we no longer have the capabilities to meet it. We still have the fighter planes, the naval ships, etc., which are effective against land forces.
And we would also still have reserves.
I just forgot one more, and some people may not know this, but the ASB doctrine talks about a joint force integration and the joint force concept. But yet in 2009, the same president did away with the Joint Forces Command that we had, which was a COCOM. It was a combatant command specifically established for joint force operations. And so here we are again, if I can say, seem like we're reinventing the wheel. We're doing this ASB doctrine and we're arguing about 2020, but in 2009, we had the established platform for joint force concepts. So where does, are we reinventing the wheel every time after a major concept? Have we really learned our lessons? And so that's something just you probably don't know, but something to consider.
Can I respond to that?
JD,
really quickly?
there's a question here in the front, and then the gentleman here in the back. And we'll take one more comment from the gentleman in the rear, and then we're gonna, then, by gosh, you're gonna have to decide.
Okay. Can I respond to that really quickly? Sorry. I
Please.
just wanted to say that I'm sure that a lot of this is very political in nature, especially like Obama doing away with the Joint Task Force. I think that everything that we're dealing with is so highly politicized that it makes it really difficult for our leaders to come up with policies that are going to be effective because people aren't educated on these issues. And it's really up to policymakers to make decisions that look good to the American public to get reelected. So.
I have a question for our debaters. So I thought a lot of the speeches were talking about China's conflict with the United States and directly confronting us, and I thought there was a really good emphasis on the United States only using military force if it was like directly concerned with our interests. But one of my questions specifically in the China example was, given China's escalation in recent months against not only, in the Taiwanese Strait, but also against some of like the South Korean ships who've tried to enter their newly declared economic zone and no-fly zone, and some of the Japanese forces, is there any concern in your minds that the United States could become embroiled in a conflict or be forced into a conflict using the air-sea battle doctrine to defend our allies because they were provoked by China?
Okay. Well, as I said before, I think that the risk of a direct conflict between the United States and China is relatively low because we are so economically interdependent. But as there is an escalation of these issues in the Strait of Hormuz in the Taiwanese Strait and over the various Asian Pacific islands, I think that it will become increasingly more important for us to have military backing and to make sure that it's clear that we do have a strong military presence, because I don't think that necessarily economic interdependence would be enough to deter an indirect conflict like something like taking over the islands. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Okay, we had a question withdrawn over here, or and one comment from the gentleman in the back, and then we'll close.
I enjoyed this because I didn't look at any one of you having specific political views that might agree or disagree with me. I looked at this, you were trying to sell a position, and that was your job tonight, was to sell each of us on this particular position that was an academic one. And from that standpoint, you were terrific. Every one of you came up and did a good job, and I could actually follow you. And I looked for your where you had your sources. Somewhere in each of those, if you're working with debate in a contest, you got to have the sources, and each of you put out the sources so I could find them and I could check them off on my sheet here. That was terrific. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so a good set of questions and commentary, and now you all have to decide. And I want to make sure I get this correct. This is a parliamentary procedure, so Dakota and Sarah, even though they were the opposition, they're the opposition to the government, and their position is that they are for ASB, air-sea battle, the air-sea battle concept. Okay, and Micah and Caitlin, representing the government, feel that the government ought to review ASB, air-sea battle, the air-sea battle concept. Their position is that this is not good for the government and we ought to rethink the entire thing, okay? So is that a fair characterization? So you have Dakota and Sarah on my right, your left, for ASB, Micah and Caitlin on my left, your right, against ASB. Okay, so we'll start. Show of hands, and JD will take a quick count. Those who believe that Dakota and Sarah won the debate, raise your hand. Everybody has to vote. Count them up. Hold your hand high. Don't be shy. Let's count. Okay, we got 17 for Dakota and Sarah for ASB. Okay, and everybody who feels persuaded by Micah and Caitlin's argument that the government ought to rethink the whole thing, it's a flawed concept. Show of hands. No, not two hands. 18. So Micah and Caitlin carry the day. Does anyone want to make a comment on why you were persuaded? Real quick, we'll entertain that subject for a second. If not, you can provide, yes, sir, in the back.
I think there's as you're going to go forward and continue working on this subject, is that right? I think there wasn't a strong enough, back to the definition of what we're talking about, I don't think there was enough contrast in the defense budget is cut, how this is different than that cut as a contrast. I don't think there's clarity there in any comment I heard. But given that, then I lean towards the team that won, because when there's not clarity, it's time to review. So I think if you want to win on the other side, you've got to make that clear.
Yeah. Okay. And does somebody want to speak about why they were persuaded by Dakota and Sarah? We'll take one such comment, maybe right there, and then we'll close it out.
I was taking note of the effort by the team on the right to try to paint them into a corner to define their position. And I think that they effectively, Sarah and Dakota effectively countered that. And in their second portions, they hit on a word that I was really looking for, the word prepare. I like preparedness, preparedness, preparedness. To me was the key essence of the, what is it, ABS or whatever?
Or whatever we were talking about.
ASB.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of, Dr. Seatman, any final remarks from you?
Thank you all so much for supporting the event.
Please do, before you leave, fill out the evaluations on this as a program and tell us what you liked, what you didn't like, how we can improve it, if you'd like to see more similar things. I have to acknowledge JD in the back there who's playing all the handyman business, but the whole idea of debating was his idea. All I do is introduce programs and sign papers. And but the last thing I want to say is I just think this is absolutely terrific. We to the degree that we didn't, we, FDM, First Division Museum, probably did a bit of a disservice in not anticipating your need in the audience for a more thorough introduction of what it is we are debating. You know, I didn't know how deep we were going to get into that, so I did a very superficial job here. And I think one of the improvements we need to make is make sure the audience understands the topic without getting buried in the labyrinth of Department of Defense budget, internecine struggles between the services and the political implications the same, and all of that sort of thing. So, I'll take that responsibility for this not being set up a little more clearly. I've already said I think the students just did a superb job. I can't tell you how it warms my heart to see 4 bright young kids that are going off into the future that are this articulate, this intelligent, this well prepared, and this thoroughly versed on at least one dimension of matters of our common defense. And it's easy to be cynical about the way Washington works, but Washington is a political city because we are a political people. And ultimately, it is our representative government that makes these decisions, and they make these decisions by many different lights that they see. And as inefficient as that is, it is what keeps any one power in our country from telling all the rest of us what we got to do. And that's the nature of democracy. Having said that, issues of war and peace, issues of our common defense are profoundly important to us as a country and a society, and to all of the people who live in our country today and will live it in the future. And so I applaud all of you for coming and listening and hearing this, and I hope it's given you some sort of an idea to go back and get online or something like that and say, well, what the heck is this they were talking about, and what do I think about it? So thank you all for coming. I thought it was just superb. Thank you again, Wheaton College debate team, and thank you, Dr. Seatman and Brittany and your assistant coaches for coming. Thanks very much. We are adjourned.